The rain in Seoul does not wash the city clean. It only turns the neon lights into jagged, bleeding streaks of color against the glass. I stood in the center of the Kang Corporation lobby, the space vast and hollow, echoing with the rhythmic, sharp click of my own heels against the marble floor. It was a sound that felt like a countdown to something I could not name. Outside, the storm lashed against the floor-to-ceiling windows, a relentless gray wall that separated me from the rest of the world. Inside, the air was filtered, chilled, and unnervingly still. I watched the water trace long, erratic paths down the pane, distorting the city lights until they looked like distant, flickering embers. Every movement I made felt amplified by the silence of the atrium. I was a stranger in this glass tower, a single point of motion, in a building that demanded absolute stillness. The lobby stretched out in every direction, cold and indifferent, swallowing the sound of the storm, until all that remained was the pressure of the silence. I took a breath, the air tasting of nothing, and waited for the elevator doors to slide open. 3 months had passed since I first walked through those revolving doors, and the initial spark of opportunity had long since dimmed into a dull, repetitive ache. Every morning, I navigated the same sterile corridors, my presence seemingly failing to register on the radar of the people around me. I was a ghost haunting a glass tower, drifting through meetings where my voice seemed to lose its frequency before it could reach anyone else. The work itself was demanding, yet it felt hollow, a series of tasks performed in a vacuum. Before I go on, kindly subscribe to this channel. Get more stories. Now let's get back to where I was. I would sit at my desk, the glow of the monitor illuminating the stacks of reports that piled up like barricades. My ambition, once a sharp, driving force, now felt like a heavy, physical burden I carried from dawn until dusk. I watched the others move in synchronized patterns, their conversations flowing around me as if I were a pillar of stone they had learned to ignore. In the break room, the chatter would cease the moment I entered, replaced by a sudden, suffocating quiet that spoke louder than any insult. The atmosphere in the office shifted whenever Min-jae moved through the floor. It was not a sound, but a change in the air pressure, a sudden tightening of the space. He walked with a singular, rhythmic pace that demanded the hallway clear before him. I saw him approach the boardroom, his focus locked on a point miles away, his movements precise and unyielding. I stepped forward, the stack of files in my hands heavy, my heartbeat thudding against my ribs. I needed him to see the data, to acknowledge the work I had completed. As he passed, I shifted my grip, but the files slipped. They hit the floor with a sharp, echoing slap, scattering across the polished tiles directly in his path. I froze, waiting for the pause, the glance, the inevitable reaction. He did not stop. He did not even break his stride. He stepped over the papers, as if they were nothing more than dust. His gaze remained fixed on the wall behind me, his eyes passing through my frame as if I were made of glass. I stood there, realizing that to him, I did not exist. My routine became a series of calculated movements designed to avoid the inevitable. I would walk into the break room, the sound of laughter and clinking mugs filling the air. But the moment my hand touched the door handle, the room went dead. Conversation stopped mid-sentence. Colleagues would turn their backs, focusing intently on their coffee or their phones, leaving me to navigate the space in a vacuum of my own making. I would pour a cup of water, the sound of the dispenser echoing like a gunshot in the quiet, and walk out without a single word exchanged. It was a systematic exclusion, a social barrier that felt as solid as the glass walls surrounding us. The meetings were no better. I would stand at the head of the boardroom table, presenting data I had spent weeks refining, my voice steady despite the prickle of heat on my neck. Min-jae would sit at the far end, his posture rigid. He never looked at my charts or at me. His eyes remained fixed on the blank wall directly behind my head. He would wait for me to finish, then stand and walk out without a nod or a critique. Every report I submitted was a plea for recognition that vanished into the void. Tuesday began with the same heavy stillness that had defined my weeks, but the air felt thinner, more brittle. I was organizing the final drafts of the market analysis when the break room door swung open with a violent force. Park marched toward my desk, his face tight with a jagged, ugly intensity. He did not speak at first. He simply waited until he was inches from me. Then, he raised my project folder high and slammed it down onto the table with a sound that cracked through the office like a whip. The papers skidded across the surface, some fluttering to the floor. "This is a mess, Amara," he said, his voice dripping with a sharp, calculated malice. "Maybe you belong back in Lagos, where this kind of work might actually pass for effort." The words hung in the air, raw and biting. I felt the heat rise in my chest, a physical pressure demanding a response. I opened my mouth to speak, to push back against the blatant hostility, but the sound died in my throat. I looked around. The entire floor had stopped. The room went deathly, suffocatingly quiet, as if the oxygen had been sucked out of the building. A shadow stretched across the floor, long and steady. Min-jae moved through the rows of desks, his footsteps the only sound in the vacuum of the office. He did not glance at me. He did not acknowledge the scattered papers on the floor. He stopped directly behind Park, his presence radiating a weight that forced the air to bend. Park turned, his sneer faltering. Min-jae leaned forward, his voice a low, dangerous hum that vibrated through the glass partitions. "Your contract is up for review, Mr. Park. Leave." The words were not a request. They were a finality that stripped the room of its remaining tension. Park stammered, his face draining of color. He gathered his things with shaking hands and retreated toward the elevators, his head bowed. I stood frozen, my pulse hammering against my ribs. I waited for Min-jae to look at me, to offer a sign, a nod, or even a flicker of recognition. He did not. He turned on his heel and walked back toward his office, leaving me in the center of the room, shivering with a confusion that felt sharper than the insult. I remained rooted to the spot long after the elevator doors clicked shut behind Park. My hands were still shaking, the adrenaline slowly receding into a dull, throbbing ache in my palms. Why had he done it? The question looped in my mind, frantic and unresolved. He had defended me with a lethal precision, yet he had not even glanced in my direction. It was a paradox that made my skin crawl. To the rest of the office, I was a ghost, a placeholder, someone to be ignored or discarded. To him, I was apparently worth the cost of a senior manager, yet I was not worth a single word of acknowledgement. I walked back to my desk, the floor feeling unstable beneath my feet. Every gaze I caught from my colleagues was now different. They weren't looking through me anymore. They were looking at me with a mixture of fear and calculation. I felt exposed. The commute back to Mapo was a blur of neon and rain-slicked pavement. My studio was small, the walls so thin I could hear the neighbors arguing 3 floors down, and the rhythmic hum of the city breathing through the glass. I locked the deadbolt, threw my bag onto the floor, and leaned my forehead against the cool surface of the window. The street below was usually deserted at this hour, a dark strip of asphalt reflecting the flickering street lamps. But tonight, just like every night since the incident, a black sedan sat idling at the curb. I watched the exhaust curl into the damp air, a ghostly plume that vanished before it reached the 2nd floor. I could see the silhouette of the driver, motionless, a statue carved out of the night. He never left the vehicle. He never looked up. He simply waited, a silent sentinel marking the boundaries of my existence. I pulled the curtains shut, but the presence remained, heavy and undeniable. I knew the car belonged to him. I knew he was not inside, yet the weight of his attention pressed against my windows. I was not alone in Mapo. The gala was a sea of forced smiles and clinking crystal. I moved through the crowd, staying near the edges, nursing a glass of water to keep my hands busy. The air was thick with perfume and the low hum of professional posturing. I found a quiet spot near the balcony, hoping for a breath of cool air, when the voices drifted toward me. 2 board members stood just beyond the heavy velvet curtains, their laughter sharp and dismissive. I froze, the glass in my hand suddenly feeling heavy. One of them spoke, his tone casual, as if discussing a broken piece of equipment. He called me an experiment. "A foreign placeholder," he said, "meant to occupy space until the merger was finalized." The other man chuckled, adding that I would be tossed out by winter. The words landed like stones in my stomach. I had spent months navigating the silence of the office, believing I was part of a larger plan. Now, the truth stripped that away. I was not a colleague. I was not an employee. I was a temporary variable in a corporate equation. The laughter behind the curtains was the final blow. I turned, my breath hitching in my throat, and pushed past the heavy doors. My feet moved faster than my thoughts, clicking rapidly against the polished floor as I sought the exit. I did not care who saw me. I did not care about the professional mask I had worn for months. I just needed to be away from the suffocating air of that room. As I rounded the corner, the fabric of my movement caught on a sharp edge of the door frame, jerking me backward. I yanked myself free, the sound of tearing fabric lost in the ambient noise of the gala. I did not stop to look back. I reached the main corridor and broke into a run, the sound of my own pulse drumming in my ears. I bypassed the elevators, taking the stairs two at a time, my vision blurring as the heat of tears finally overwhelmed me. I hit the lobby floor, the vast space echoing with the sound of my frantic breathing. Outside, the storm was a wall of gray, rain lashing against the glass. The heavy glass door refused to budge. I shoved against it again, my muscles straining, but the mechanism held firm against the pressure of the storm outside. I was trapped between the cold marble of the lobby and the relentless rain. Then, the world shifted. A hand clamped onto my wrist. It was not a grab, not a violent jerk, but a firm, grounding anchor that stopped my momentum instantly. I gasped, my heart hammering against my ribs, and spun around, ready to pull away. I expected security, or perhaps one of the board members, but the face looking back at me was the last one I anticipated. It was Min-jae. He stood there, his breathing ragged, his presence completely out of place in the sterile, quiet lobby. His hair was damp, clinging to his forehead, and his usual composure was entirely gone. He looked frantic, his eyes darting toward the elevators before locking onto mine with an intensity that made me freeze. He did not let go of my wrist. The silence between us was heavy, punctuated only by the rhythmic thrum of rain against the glass. The distance had finally collapsed. He did not wait for me to speak. His grip on my wrist tightened, guiding me away from the glass walls and into the deep, artificial shadows cast by a massive marble pillar. The sudden shift in light felt like stepping into another world. He pressed his back against the stone, his chest heaving as he looked over his shoulder toward the empty elevators. The frantic energy radiating from him was palpable, a stark departure from the man who had ignored my existence for months. He leaned in, his face inches from mine, and the air between us grew thick with the weight of his unspoken words. When he finally spoke, his voice was not the low, dangerous hum I was used to hearing. It was thin, strained, and visibly trembling. "I have been trying so hard," he whispered, the words catching in his throat. "I have been fighting every instinct to stay away from you." He looked at me then, really looked at me, as if he were seeing the person behind the desk for the very first time. The silence of the lobby seemed to amplify the sound of his ragged breathing. His hand moved, his thumb tracing a slow, deliberate line over my knuckles. The contact was startlingly gentle, a stark contrast to the frantic energy that had pulled me into the shadows. It felt like a confession made without a single word, a silent admission that the distance he had built was failing. I held my breath, waiting for the rest of it, for the reason behind the months of silence and the sudden, desperate intervention. He looked toward the elevators again, his jaw tightening until the muscles stood out. "Why?" I managed to gasp. He turned his gaze back to me, his eyes searching mine with a terrifying clarity. "Because if they know you matter to me," he whispered, "they will destroy you to get to me." The weight of his words hit me harder than the physical force of his grip. He didn't let go of my hand, and for the first time, I understood that being seen by him was the most dangerous thing I could ever do. The next morning, the office felt like a battlefield, where I was the only one who knew the rules. I walked to my desk, my pulse steady, watching Min-jae move through the floor with his usual detached stride. He did not glance at me. He did not acknowledge my presence. To the rest of the staff, he was the same distant executive, and I was the same invisible employee. But the game had fundamentally shifted. I pulled a stack of reports toward me, the paper crisp and cold under my fingertips. As I flipped through the pages, a small, folded slip of paper slid out. It was a handwritten note, the ink dark and precise. The instructions were brief, pointing me away from a project that the board had rigged to fail. I looked up, scanning the room, but Min-jae was already turning the corner toward his office. He had not looked back, yet the path ahead was suddenly clear. Throughout the day, every time I reached for a file, I found his silent guidance waiting for me. We were playing a dangerous game of shadows. The notes were only the beginning of the shift. I started to notice how the environment around me began to change in ways that only I would recognize. One morning, I walked into the break room to find a fresh cup of jasmine tea waiting on the counter, the steam rising in a thin, fragrant ribbon. No one else in the office drank that blend. I looked toward the doorway, but the hall was empty. A few hours later, I returned to my desk to find that the floral arrangement that usually sat on the corner of my cubicle had been replaced. The lilies, which always made my throat tighten and my eyes water, were gone. In their place stood a simple, hardy plant that required no attention. I reached out, my fingers brushing the cool leaves, and felt a sudden, sharp intake of breath. He was watching. He was not just guiding my work. He was curating the space around me, removing the irritants, and providing the comforts he knew I craved. He knew the exact route I took to the subway, the way I hesitated at the crosswalk, and the specific tea that calmed my nerves. Every detail was a silent message, a tether connecting us through the sterile, cold air of the office. The realization hit me with the force of a physical blow. The sun set behind the glass towers, signaling the end of our performance. I walked out of the lobby, my footsteps echoing against the polished floor, while he remained in his office, a distant figure behind a closed door. To the security cameras and the late-night cleaning crews, we were nothing more than a CEO and a subordinate, separated by floors and status. I took the elevator down, pressing the button for the basement level, my heart hammering against my ribs. The parking garage was a cavern of concrete and shadows, smelling of exhaust and damp oil. I navigated the rows of parked vehicles, keeping my head down, scanning for the familiar silhouette of his sedan. I reached the back door, pulled it open, and slipped into the darkness of the back seat. The lock clicked shut, sealing us away. We were two people clinging to a secret, terrified of the light, existing only in the quiet, hidden spaces. Inside the cabin, the world outside ceased to exist. The glass windows were tinted, turning the garage lights into distant, flickering ghosts. He did not speak at first. He simply reached across the gap between the seats and found my hand. His skin was cool, but his grip was immediate and absolute. He interlaced his fingers with mine, pressing our palms together until the knuckles turned white. It was a desperate, crushing hold, as if he were trying to pull the reality of my presence into his own pulse. I felt the steady, rhythmic vibration of the idling engine beneath us, a low hum that vibrated through the floorboards and into my own bones. In this small, enclosed space, everything else, the board meetings, the cold stares, the endless corporate games, felt like a dream I had once had. Here, there was only the weight of his hand and the frantic, unspoken urgency of his touch. He squeezed again, his thumb tracing the line of my wrist, anchoring me to the seat. I leaned back, closing my eyes, letting the pressure of his fingers define the boundaries of my world. For these few minutes, we were simply two people holding on to the only thing that felt solid. He shifted, his movements slow and deliberate, until his forehead rested against mine. The silence in the car was no longer heavy, it was expectant. "I am building a way out," he whispered, the words barely audible over the faint hum of the engine. He did not pull away. He kept his eyes locked on mine, his breathing steady and controlled. The merger is the key. Once the papers are signed, the board loses their leverage over my decisions. He explained the strategy in short, clipped sentences, detailing how the shift in corporate structure would strip them of their power to dictate his life. His voice lacked the cold, detached tone he used in the boardroom. It was raw, focused, and entirely directed at me. "After that, they cannot touch us. I will be able to look at you in the light, anywhere, without hiding." I listened, feeling the weight of his words settle into the space between us. It was a dangerous gamble, a high-stakes move that could cost him everything. He leaned closer, his grip on my hand tightening as if to reassure himself. We sat in the dim light of the garage, two architects of a future that existed only in the quiet, plotting our escape from the glass tower. The sanctuary of the garage was an illusion. High above, in the sterile, fluorescent-lit corridors of the executive floor, the board members had been watching. They did not need to break into our private conversations. They only needed to track the anomalies. They noticed the way Min-jae lingered near my desk, the way he adjusted his schedule to match my lunch break, and the way he looked at me when he thought the cameras were off. They began to piece together the pattern. They realized that I was not just a placeholder for the merger, but the reason for his hesitation. They met in the private lounge, their voices low, their faces unreadable. They decided that removing Min-jae was too risky for the stock price. Instead, they would remove the variable that distracted him. They pulled my personnel file from the digital archives. They scrutinized my visa status, my bank records, and my recent communications. They began to construct a narrative of incompetence and security risks. By the time I walked into the office the next morning, the trap was already set. The strike was silent and surgical. At precisely 10 in the morning, a massive surge of encrypted data flowed from my terminal to a blacklisted server in another country. I was sitting at my desk, typing a routine report, when my screen flickered and went black. A red warning light pulsed on the console. Before I could reach for the mouse, the security team arrived. They did not ask questions. They confiscated my laptop, my access badge, and my phone. The board had planted the files while I was in the break room, creating a digital footprint that pointed directly to me. They didn't stop at internal termination. Within the hour, they leaked the fabricated breach to the local media and filed a formal complaint with the immigration office. My visa status, once stable, was suddenly flagged for immediate review due to criminal investigation. I watched from the lobby as my name was scrubbed from the company directory. Every project I had touched was marked as compromised. They were not just firing me, they were ensuring I could never work in the city again. They had turned my own ambition into the weapon that would dismantle my life. The glass tower, once a place of opportunity, had become a prison of my own making. A single notification pinged on my phone, a digital summons to the boardroom. I stood up, my legs feeling heavy, and began the walk across the open-plan office. The silence was absolute. Dozens of heads remained fixed on their screens. The rhythmic clicking of keyboards the only sound in the room. No one looked up, no one offered a nod. I was a contagion, and they were keeping their distance. I reached the heavy double doors at the end of the hall. I pushed them open. The air inside was still, filtered, and freezing. The long mahogany table stretched out before me, polished to a mirror finish. Around it, the board members sat in high-backed chairs, their faces obscured by the dim lighting. They did not stand. They did not speak. They simply watched as I walked to the far end of the room. I stopped at the designated spot, my heels echoing against the hardwood. The malice in the room was a physical weight, pressing against my chest. The side door clicked open. Min-jae stepped into the room. He did not glance at me. He walked the length of the table with a measured, rhythmic stride, his presence drawing every eye in the room. He reached the head of the table and pulled out the central chair. The wood scraped against the floor, a sharp, jarring sound. He sat down and placed his hands flat on the polished surface. His posture was rigid, his shoulders squared. He looked at the board members, then slowly turned his gaze toward the documents piled in front of him. His expression was devoid of any flicker of recognition or warmth. His jaw was set, his features pulled into a hard, unyielding line. He adjusted a single page, aligning it perfectly with the edge of the table. He did not blink, he did not breathe. He remained perfectly still, a statue carved from granite. The board members leaned forward, their eyes fixed on his hands. Min-jae shifted his weight. He finally lifted his head, turning his gaze toward me. For a fraction of a second, the stone mask cracked. His eyes searched mine, pupils dilated, a silent, frantic plea. For me to see the truth beneath his cold exterior. He was begging for understanding, a desperate signal hidden from the board members. Watching his every move, I held my breath, the air in the room feeling thin and sharp. He looked away, his jaw tightening until the muscle pulsed against his skin. He reached for the heavy fountain pen, resting on the mahogany. His hand hovered over the document. He gripped the barrel, his knuckles turning white, and pressed the nib to the paper. The scratch of the metal against the parchment was audible. He signed his name with a single, fluid motion, the ink dark and permanent. He pulled the pen back and set it down. It struck the polished wood with a sharp, metallic clack. He pushed the folder toward the center. I stood up. The chair made a soft, grating sound against the carpet. No one spoke. I reached for my bag, my fingers brushing the strap, and pulled it onto my shoulder. The weight of it was negligible, yet it felt like I was carrying the entire duration of my stay in that tower. I turned toward the door. My heels clicked against the floor, a rhythmic, hollow sound that seemed to grow louder with every step. I did not look back at the table. I did not look at the board members. I walked through the heavy glass doors. The hallway felt longer than usual, the lights humming overhead. I reached the elevator bank and pressed the button. I stepped inside, the mirrored walls reflecting a version of myself that looked tired and hollowed out. I walked across the marble floor and stepped into the rain. The city lights blurred into jagged streaks of color. I had nothing left. The Incheon terminal was a cavern of echoes. Announcements in 3 languages bounced off the high glass ceilings, blending into a dull, rhythmic roar. I walked through the crowd, my bag heavy against my shoulder, the strap digging into my skin. Every face I passed was a blur of movement, people rushing toward reunions or departures, unaware of the silence I carried. I reached gate 42 and found a seat in the back row. The plastic chair was cold, biting through the fabric of my seat. I set my bag down and stared at the departures board. The text flickered, shifting from Korean to English, listing destinations that felt like a different lifetime. Lagos was listed in white letters, a destination that felt more like a retreat than a return. I pressed my palms against my knees, feeling the tremor in my hands. The air conditioning hummed, a constant, sterile sound that filled the gaps in my thoughts. I looked at my reflection in the dark window beside me. I leaned my head back against the wall and closed my eyes. The terminal was full of life, yet I felt as if I had already ceased to exist in this city. The departure gate was a sterile island. I watched the clock on the wall. The second hand ticked with a mechanical indifference that made my pulse jump. Every minute that passed felt like a door locking behind me. I reached into my pocket and pulled out my phone. The screen remained dark. No messages, no missed calls, just a black reflection of a woman who had lost everything. I turned the phone over in my palm, feeling the smooth glass, then tucked it away. The silence of the terminal seemed to thicken. I thought of the basement garage, the smell of rain on his skin, and the way he held my hand in the dark. That world was gone now. It belonged to a version of me that no longer existed. A sharp chime cut through the air, followed by a voice announcing the final boarding call. The sound was thin and clinical. I stood up. My legs felt heavy, as if the floor were pulling at my heels. I adjusted the strap of my bag one last time. I walked toward the gate agent, my eyes fixed on the narrow path to the jet bridge. There was no point in looking back. The city was already behind me, and he was nothing more than a ghost in the neon blur of a life I had left to rot. I reached the gate attendant, my boarding pass trembling between my fingers. She reached out, her hand hovering over the scanner, when the terminal air shifted. It started as a ripple in the crowd, a sudden, sharp intake of breath from the people standing near the security checkpoint. The rhythmic, polite shuffling of travelers turned into a frantic scramble. Someone shouted, a sharp, guttural sound that cut through the sterile hum of the boarding area. The gate attendant paused, her eyes darting toward the commotion. I turned, my heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. The crowd was parting, forced aside by a man in a dark coat who moved with a singular, desperate velocity. He didn't look at the security guards trying to intercept him. He didn't look at the cameras. He was a blur of motion against the static, gray backdrop of the terminal. People stumbled back, luggage clattering to the floor as he shoved past them. I felt the breath leave my lungs. The world narrowed down to that one figure, his pace frantic, his focus locked entirely on the gate. The gate attendant stepped forward to block the path, but he didn't slow down. He was coming, and the entire terminal seemed to hold its breath, waiting to see who would break the silence first. The security guard reached for his arm, but he spun away with a violent, jarring motion that sent the man stumbling into a row of plastic chairs. He did not stop. He did not apologize. He did not even blink. His gaze was a physical weight, cutting through the terminal air, fixed entirely on the spot where I stood. He ignored the frantic protests of the gate staff and the murmurs of the passengers. The distance between us shrank with every stride he took. He was breathing hard, his chest heaving, yet his eyes remained steady, burning with a desperate, singular intent. He shoved past a businessman who tried to block his path, his hands moving with a frantic, uncoordinated energy. The terminal, usually a place of rigid rules and orderly lines, dissolved into a blur of motion around him. He was a storm inside a glass box. He reached the gate barrier and vaulted over the stanchion, his feet hitting the floor with a heavy, echoing thud. He didn't look at the cameras or the staff. He stopped 10 feet away, his body angled toward me, his presence dominating the space. The noise of the terminal faded into a sudden, terrifying silence. Time did not just slow, it fractured. I stood frozen, my bag slipping from my shoulder, the strap digging into my palm. Was this real, or was my mind finally breaking under the weight of the last few weeks? I blinked, expecting the image of him to dissolve. He remained. He stood there, chest rising and falling, his face a map of exhaustion and something else, a raw, terrifying clarity. The terminal hummed around us, a mechanical drone that felt miles away. I looked at the gate, then back at him, searching for the mask. It was gone. He took one step, his boots scraping against the polished floor, a sound that cut through the silence like a blade. He looked at me, not as an employee, not as a placeholder, but as if I were the only solid thing in a world that had suddenly turned to smoke. My pulse thundered in my ears, drowning out the distant announcements. I wanted to run, to hide, to reach out, but my limbs felt weighted with lead. He reached out a hand, fingers trembling, and for a heartbeat, I was certain I was dreaming. The terminal did not just go quiet, it surrendered to the silence. A woman near the duty-free shop stopped mid-stride, her suitcase handle slipping from her grip. A group of travelers near the boarding gate turned in unison, their chatter dying in their throats as they recognized the man standing before me. The air grew heavy, charged with the static of 1,000 unspoken questions. Nobody moved. Nobody dared to break the stillness. The security staff, who had been closing in seconds ago, retreated a step, their hands dropping to their sides as they sensed the shift in gravity. The CEO of the most powerful corporation in the city was here, standing in the middle of a public terminal, ignoring the world to focus on a single, fired employee. The silence was absolute, save for the low, rhythmic hum of the ventilation system. Every eye in the vicinity was locked on us, a circle of spectators. The tension was a physical pressure, a tightening in the chest that made it hard to draw a full breath. He stood at the center of this vacuum. He was no longer the man who signed papers in a boardroom. He was a man standing on the edge of a precipice, and the entire terminal waited for the fall. He crossed the remaining distance in 3 long, uneven strides. His breathing was ragged, audible even over the distant drone of the airport machinery. He stopped inches from me, his presence overwhelming, a wall of heat and urgency that made the terminal air feel thin. He looked disheveled, his movements sharp and uncoordinated, as if he had run for miles to reach this gate. He paused, his chest heaving, and for a fleeting second, he stumbled, catching himself on the back of a plastic chair. He did not look at the crowd, nor at the security guards watching from the periphery. He looked only at me. His eyes were bloodshot, searching mine with a desperation that stripped away the last remnants of his composure. He was waiting. He was asking for permission to shatter the life he had built, to abandon the power he had spent years hoarding. His jaw tightened, a muscle jumping beneath the skin, as he weighed the cost of the next 5 seconds. He was ready to burn it all down. He reached out, his fingers trembling as they clamped onto my jaw. The world around us seemed to tilt on its axis. He did not care about the cameras, the board members watching from the shadows, or the company security closing in. He pulled my face toward his grip firm and desperate. He kissed me, a hard, bruising contact that tasted of salt and adrenaline. The crowd gasped, a collective sound that rippled through the terminal, but he did not pull away. He broke the kiss, his forehead resting against mine, his breath coming in ragged gasps. "I quit," he said, his voice cutting through the terminal noise like a blade. "I am not the CEO anymore. I am just a man who wants to go home with you." He let go of my face and grabbed my hand, his palm rough against mine. He turned his back on the boarding gate, on the flight to Lagos, and on the life he had spent a decade building. We walked past the security line, toward the exit. He kept his grip on my hand, leaving the neon lights of Seoul to fade into the distance behind us. The automatic doors slid open, and the cold, damp air of the city hit us instantly. Rain slicked the pavement, reflecting the flickering street lamps in long, distorted ribbons of light. We moved quickly across the concrete, our footsteps echoing in the vast, empty drop-off zone. He led me to a sedan parked near the curb, his hand never leaving mine. He opened the passenger door, shielding my head with his palm as I slid inside. The interior smelled of leather and rain. He rounded the hood, his movements fluid and unhurried, and climbed into the driver's seat. He didn't reach for his phone. He didn't check the time. He simply turned the key, and the engine hummed to life, a low vibration that traveled through the floorboards. He shifted into gear and pulled away from the terminal, the glass walls of the building shrinking in the rearview mirror. The city lights of Seoul began to blur into a singular, distant glow. He kept one hand on the wheel and the other locked firmly in mine, his grip steady. We were moving away from the noise. For the first time, the road ahead was ours to navigate. The neon skyline of Seoul eventually vanished, replaced by the dark, rolling silhouettes of hills. The highway narrowed, the roar of the city traffic fading into the rhythmic hum of tires on wet asphalt. He drove with a steady focus, his eyes fixed on the path illuminated by the headlights. We passed through small, quiet towns where the streetlights were sparse and the windows were dark. The tension that had defined our lives for months slowly drained from the car, leaving behind a heavy, quiet stillness. We pulled off the main road onto a gravel path that led toward the coast. The sound of the ocean began to rise. He slowed the car to a stop near the edge of a bluff. He turned off the engine. The sudden silence was absolute. We stepped out into the cool, salt-heavy air. Below us, the tide pulled away from the shore, leaving the sand clean. A small, wooden structure stood tucked against the tree line, its windows dark. We walked toward it, the gravel crunching beneath our boots. He pushed the door open, the hinges groaning in the damp night air. Inside, the space was sparse, smelling of pine and dust. A single lamp sat on a rough-hewn table. He struck a match, and the flame flared, casting long, steady shadows across the walls. We moved to the center of the room. He set his keys on the wood, a final, metallic sound that signaled the end of the journey. I watched him pull off his watch and set it beside them. We sat on the floor, our backs against the wall, listening to the wind rattle the shutters. There were no reports to file, no meetings to attend, and no one to answer to. He took my hand, his palm rough and warm against mine. We stayed there as the night deepened, watching the lamp flicker until it burned out. In the total darkness, we didn't speak. We didn't need to. The silence was no longer a weapon or a cage. It was simply the sound of our own breathing, steady and synchronized. Morning light filtered through the gaps in the shutters, painting thin, dusty lines across the floor. I stood up, the wood cool beneath my feet, and walked to the door. I pushed it wide, letting the crisp, morning air flood the room. Outside, the world was vast and quiet. The ocean was a flat, gray sheet under a pale sky. He followed me out, his footsteps heavy and rhythmic on the porch. We walked down the slope toward the water, the grass damp with dew against our ankles. There was no phone to check, no schedule to follow, and no shadow of the city looming over us. We reached the shoreline where the sand was packed hard and smooth by the tide. He stopped and turned to face me. He took both my hands, his grip firm and steady. We looked back at the cabin, then out toward the endless stretch of the horizon. The wind picked up, pulling at our hair, but we did not turn away. We began to walk along the water. Every step was deliberate. Every breath was our own. We kept walking until the city was a memory that no longer held any weight. The path narrowed as the cliffs rose higher, forcing us to walk in single file. The ground shifted from soft earth to jagged, salt-crusted stone. I kept my eyes on the trail, feeling the spray of the ocean against my face. A sudden drop appeared ahead, a steep, winding track carved into the rock. We began the descent, our boots finding purchase on the uneven surface. My hands brushed against the damp, cold granite of the cliff wall for balance. We reached the bottom, where the sand was dark and coarse. The roar of the waves hitting the rocks drowned out everything else. We walked to the waterline, the foam swirling around our feet, pulling the sand away with each retreat of the tide. I looked at him, and he nodded, his gaze fixed on the vast open expanse of the sea. There were no more decisions to make, no more roles to play. We stood there for a long time, watching the horizon where the gray water met the sky. The weight of the past had finally dissolved into the rhythm of the waves. We turned away from the land, facing the open water, and began to walk along the shoreline, moving steadily toward the edge of the world. The beach ended against a wall of black basalt, but tucked into a small inlet, a wooden boat rested on the wet sand. I walked toward it, the water soaking into my boots. He reached the boat first, gripping the gunwale and pushing against the heavy weight of the hull. The wood groaned as it slid over the pebbles and into the shallow surf. We waded into the cold water, the current tugging at our legs, and climbed over the side. He took the oars, his knuckles white as he braced against the resistance of the tide. With a sharp pull, the bow swung away from the shore. We moved into deeper water, the rhythmic splash of the oars, the only sound in the vast space. I sat in the stern, watching the beach shrink, until it was just a thin, dark line against the base of the cliffs. The land grew distant, its details fading into the gray mist of the horizon. We did not speak. We did not look back. The boat cut through the surface, leaving a wake that vanished as quickly as it formed. We were moving into the open sea, the shoreline behind us now nothing more than a memory. The rhythm of the rowing became our only reality. The mist began to thin as we moved further from the coast. The water changed from a dark, churning gray to a deep, still blue. I rested my hands on the edge of the boat, feeling the vibration of the wood against my palms. He pulled the oars inside, the blades dripping water onto the floorboards. The sudden silence was heavy, broken only by the gentle slap of waves against the hull. We drifted. The current took hold, pulling us steadily away from the land we had left behind. I looked at his hands, calloused and steady, resting on his knees. He looked toward the horizon, his jaw relaxed for the first time. The sun began to dip, casting a long golden path across the surface of the sea. We did not need to speak. The distance between us and the life we once knew grew with every passing minute. I reached out, my fingers brushing against his, and he turned his palm to catch my hand. We sat in the center of the vast expanse, two small figures in a wooden shell, surrounded by nothing but the rhythm of the tide. The shoreline was gone. The sky deepened into a bruised purple, then black. Stars appeared one by one, reflecting in the glass-like surface of the water, until it felt as if we were floating in the center of a galaxy. I pulled a thin blanket from the bottom of the boat and draped it over our shoulders. The air turned sharp and cold, biting at our skin, but we stayed close, our shoulders pressed together for warmth. He leaned his head back against the stern, his eyes fixed on the constellations above. I traced the lines of his palm with my thumb, feeling the steady thrum of his pulse beneath the skin. The boat barely moved, caught in a gentle, rhythmic swell that rocked us like a cradle. We were miles from the nearest port, untethered from the maps and expectations that had once defined our days. There were no sirens, no glass towers, and no board meetings. Only the vast, indifferent expanse of the sea and the quiet breathing of the man beside me. I realized there was no longer a boundary. A faint glow flickered on the far horizon, the pulse of a distant lighthouse or a passing ship. He reached for the tiller, his movements deliberate and slow, and nudged the boat further into the open dark. We watched the light fade until it was nothing more than a memory against the ink-black water. The cold air settled around us, heavy with the scent of salt and deep-sea currents. I shifted my weight, the wood of the boat groaning softly beneath me. He let go of the tiller and reached for my hand, his grip firm and grounding. We sat in the center of the vast, rhythmic motion, the water pushing us forward into the unknown. There was no map, no destination, and no clock to dictate our rhythm. The only sound was the water parting at the bow and the steady, synchronized breathing of two people who had left everything behind. I looked up at the stars, their light sharp and cold, and felt the weight of the city finally lift from my shoulders. We were moving toward the silence. The darkness began to thin, turning from charcoal to a pale, bruised gray. A thin line of gold appeared on the eastern horizon, cutting through the haze. I stood up, my legs stiff from the long night, and walked to the bow. The water changed, shifting from black to a deep, translucent blue. He joined me, his hand finding the small of my back, his touch firm against the fabric. We watched as the sun broke the surface, a sliver of fire that turned the waves into shifting plates of light. The air warmed, losing its sharp, biting edge, and the wind shifted, carrying the scent of land, damp earth, and wild grass. We let the boat drift until the keel scraped against the soft, wet sand of an unknown beach. I stepped over the side, my boots sinking into the silt, and turned back to reach for his hand. We walked onto the shore, leaving the boat to the tide, and stepped into the quiet light of a day that belonged only to us. The sand was cool and packed hard under our feet. We walked past the high tide line, where driftwood and tangled kelp lay scattered in the morning light. Behind us, the boat rocked gently in the shallows, a silent vessel tethered to nothing. We didn't look back. The terrain shifted from sand to coarse grass, then to a narrow path winding between low, scrubby trees. I stopped to listen. There was no hum of electricity, no distant rumble of traffic, only the rhythmic sound of our own breathing and the wind moving through the leaves. He took the lead, his boots crunching on the gravel path, his pace steady and unhurried. We climbed a small ridge, the ground rising beneath us until the bay was hidden from view. The air here smelled of pine needles and dry earth. We reached a clearing where the path split, and he stopped, looking at the horizon ahead. He didn't speak. He simply reached out, took my hand again, and we stepped forward together. The path stretched out, narrow and winding, leading us deeper into the quiet expanse of the island. We kept walking until the trees closed in behind us. The path leveled out at the crest of the ridge. Below us, a hidden valley opened up, sheltered by high, jagged cliffs that blocked the wind. A narrow stream cut through the center of the grass, its water clear and fast-moving. We descended the slope, our boots sliding on the loose shale, until we reached the flat ground near the water. There, half hidden by overgrown vines, stood a small structure of stone and timber. I walked to the door and pushed. It gave way with a low groan of rusted hinges. Inside, the air was cool and smelled of dust and dried cedar. A single wooden table sat in the center of the room, and a stone hearth occupied the far wall. We entered together. I set my bag on the floor. He moved to the window and pulled back the heavy shutters, letting the morning sun flood the space. We stood in the center, the silence of the valley pressing in. There were no phones, no schedules, and no glass towers. I walked to the hearth, knelt, and began to clear the old ash. He knelt beside me, his hands finding mine in the dust. We were here. We were still. The journey was over. The first light of dawn hit the valley floor, turning the dew on the grass into silver. I stepped out of the cabin, the cold air biting at my skin. He was already by the stream, stacking flat stones to divert the flow, his movements precise and rhythmic. I walked toward the tree line, my boots sinking into the soft, damp earth. I gathered fallen branches, the bark rough and brittle against my palms. Every snap of wood was a clean, sharp sound that echoed off the cliffs. I returned to the hearth, laid the kindling, and struck a match. The flame caught, licking at the dry cedar. He walked in, his hands wet from the stream, and stood by the fire. He didn't look back toward the ridge. He looked at the flames, then at me. We sat on the floor, the firelight dancing on the stone walls, and watched the fire burn down to embers. The valley floor expanded as the sun climbed higher, revealing the full scope of our new perimeter. I walked to the edge of the stream, my boots crunching over smooth river stones. He followed, carrying a coil of rope and a heavy iron spade. We reached the northern boundary where a collapsed stone wall marked the end of the property. We spent the afternoon lifting the heavy, moss-covered rocks, fitting them back into place one by one. The work was demanding. My palms grew raw, and the muscles in my shoulders burned with every lift. He worked with the same intensity, his breathing steady, his focus entirely on the stone beneath his hands. When the wall was finally level, we stood back to inspect the line. It was solid. It was ours. We walked to the highest point of the ridge and looked down at the cabin, now a small, dark speck in the vast green. We walked back down the slope, our shadows stretching long across the grass as evening approached. The sun dipped below the jagged horizon, casting long, thin shadows across the cabin floor. I blew out the lantern, the wick smoldering for a moment before the darkness settled in. Outside, the crickets began their rhythmic pulse, a sound that filled the space where the city noise used to be. I felt the floorboards shift under my weight as I moved toward the bed. He was already there, his steady breathing syncing with the wind. I reached out, my fingers finding the rough wool of the blanket. I pulled it up, the fabric heavy and warm. We lay in the dark, the scent of pine and wood smoke clinging to the air. There were no phones to check, no reports to file. I closed my eyes, the tension of the last year finally draining from my limbs. I let the darkness pull me into sleep. Don't forget to subscribe for more love and suspense stories. Share, like video.